Now I'd like to introduce John Glover presenting his thesis titled ADHD Accommodations in Classical Schools, Challenges and Solutions.
Imagine you're sitting in class, trying your best to pay attention and take notes, but then you start to hear all these micro noises, pens clicking, chairs squeaking, clock on the wall ticking, and many more. This was a reality for Lewis, a student who genuinely wanted to do well in school. He described his mind not as a quiet place for his thoughts to gather, but 5 radio channels blasting at once. Over the past 20 years, ADHD diagnosis in children has risen 4%. And the definition for ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, has risen 4% in the last 20 years, resulting in 1 in every 10 kids in the United States being diagnosed with it. ADHD affects the student's ability to focus, stay organized, and complete tasks on time. This upward trajectory of diagnosis highlights the necessity for academic accommodations. The DSM-5-TR characterizes ADHD as a persistent pattern of inattention and/or hyperactivity impulsivity that interferes with functioning, and development. With the rise of ADHD in children, classical schools need to pay attention to whether and how they should accommodate students with ADHD. In his book, Norms and Nobility, David Hicks says the purpose of education is not the assimilation of facts or knowledge, but the habituation of mind and body to will and act in accordance with which one knows. For students with ADHD, the learning process is often hindered by inattention, organization, and time management. These symptoms of ADHD can be mitigated with certain classroom accommodations. Historically, classical schools tend to make fewer accommodations for students for a couple reasons. They have a stricter curriculum, and classical schools generally have fewer resources to allocate to students. Classical schools are cautious with accommodations that they implement because they do not want some students to negatively affect other students' experience in the classroom. And they want to avoid watering down the curriculum just to accommodate some students. Classical school believes that fairness comes from a stable, time-tested structure where all students meet the same expectations. My thesis argues that classical schools should provide ADHD accommodations that promote independence, like guided notes and structured recitation, that supports attention and organization without disrupting the classroom, while avoiding accommodations like time extension and separate room testing that fails to promote independence and build long-term academic skills. Any accommodations that are too disruptive should be implemented in the home. To be worth implementing, ADHD accommodations must reasonably improve the outcome of learning for the student. They must help them become more independent and stay on track with the classical school's classroom vision. An improved academic outcome for ADHD students is not just grades going up, maintaining more information, or completing tasks on time. It is rather an overall improvement. For each of these areas, they have their own values. Having ADHD students work towards independence is crucial because later on in their life, when they're at college or working a job, they will not have a safety net to fall back on. Research published in Educational Accommodations for Children and Adolescents with ADHD highlights that the most common ADHD accommodations like extra time for assignment, a quiet room for assessments, fail to show strong evidence of them being effective. The main issue of granting extra time or quiet space to work is that a student can still miss steps or get the answers wrong because the accommodation they have been given does not actually address the root problem of the inattention or not reading the question carefully. Too many schools are too quick to jump the gun on ADHD accommodations because most of the time they do not strengthen the ADHD student to be able to succeed on their own. On the surface, it doesn't seem like there's a problem with any accommodation. How could helping someone necessarily hinder them? The problem lies in independence, waste of time, and no real improvements. The goal of ADHD accommodation should be to build up a student to a point where they do not truly need the accommodation to complete tasks on time. Teachers might try to implement accommodations that do not yield good learning outcomes, such as time extensions, less overall work for them to do, or separate testing room. These waste time compared to different accommodations that might be better for students. Additionally, students may become too reliant on accommodations rather than learn the skills that will help them succeed in the future, such as managing their attention, task completion. One example of this is time extensions. While having more time to think is not bad, it does not teach the student how to manage their time well because later in life, deadlines are rarely negotiable. and having students getting acquainted with more time will have them ill-prepared for the adult world. The last consequence of rushed accommodations is no real improvement. They are considered rushed because most schools just choose accommodations and not monitor them. Instead, they should monitor it regularly to see if the students with ADHD are making improvements from it. If in the end the student does not grow, then the accommodation was for nothing. In classical schools, where structure is emphasized, every accommodation added must genuinely improve the student's academic outcome. Every accommodation added must not interfere with the classroom structure. A quick example of that becomes a distraction is a fidget spinner with the obnoxious noise that it makes. When schools try to implement ADHD accommodations, they often do it without consistent evaluation. Those supports often fail to improve learning and can actually create new problems without the school knowing. What often happens when schools try to help ADHD students is they often end up doing a Band-Aid solution. The Band-Aid solution is helping the students at that time, but it does not address the root problem: time management, organization, and paying attention. The problem with most accommodations is that the ADHD student is not building habits that will help them in the future, but instead they get placed into a more ideal environment to succeed. Any ADHD accommodation that might be added must be a low disruption. If the accommodation interferes with other students' education, then it should not be added. Low disruption matters to classical schools because everyone is going at the same pace, and if it distracts others, they might start to fall behind. And any accommodation added must prioritize scaffolding and reduction, a process of systematically withdrawing supports over several years to ensure that students achieve academic independence. This matters to classical schools because they want their students to become independent and be able to learn on their own. If this is ignored, the classical schools will be making ADHD students more dependent on external help rather than being independent. One example of a good ADHD accommodation would be guided notes. Guided notes are a low distraction because it's just paper and everyone can have a guided note sheet. It still requires the ADHD student to learn to process new information. Guided notes are good because it can be difficult to take notes and try to process new information at the same time. But what makes guided notes great for making ADHD students more independent is it teaches them how to take good notes. Accommodations that cannot be made in the classroom should be made in the home. It would be hard to find someone that would argue that classical schools should give up their whole classroom structure just to accommodate someone with ADHD. This is because people acknowledge that ADHD students need some external help. However, there are some helpful accommodations that are not appropriate for the classroom. Some ADHD accommodations are effective but take away precious class time. Another problem with some accommodations is not the importance but the location where it's being implemented. It is important for the classroom to have constraints because it is a fixed schedule and there is one teacher, finite amount of time for many students. At home, the main goal for supporting ADHD students is organization, habit building, and time management, because these skills require consistent routines and a lot of reinforcement, which simply cannot be met in the classroom. Some classical schools believe that ADHD accommodations should be kept to a minimum because they want to avoid advantages, maintain equal standards, and preserve classroom order. Classical schools have a valid and noble goal in mind: to pursue wisdom, virtue, and eloquence. Virtue is the habit of doing the right thing at the right time in the right way. Wisdom is applying knowledge, experiences, and understanding to make good decisions, and eloquence is the ability to convey powerful emotions in the ideas with clarity, beauty, and persuasively. Classical schools are so passionate about these core ideas because they believe that education's purpose is not just to get students into college so they have a good job, but rather education's purpose is to shape them as human beings. Every classical school believes that students are held to the same standards, like turning assignments on time, wearing assigned uniforms, and a limited use of technology. While these goals are undoubtedly notable, any classical school cannot effectively achieve virtue without considering the nature of a student. If a student's brain cannot neurologically meet a standard, then refusing to provide an accommodation does not build a student's character, it just creates a biological barrier. The ultimate goal of classical education is, as David Hicks said, the purpose of education is not the assimilation of facts or retention of information, but the habituation of the mind and body to act and will in accordance with what one knows. And refusing to incorporate any accommodations in order to maintain the playing field is to ignore the biological reality that prevents some students from even reaching the starting line. If we truly believe education is about the whole self, then we must give students the tools to build those habits. Guide notes and structured recitations are not shortcuts, but rather ladders, and they allow ADHD students to reach the same goals. ADHD students need to climb towards the same peaks of wisdom, virtue, and eloquence as their peers. We do not need to give ADHD students a different mountain to climb. We just need to give them the same gear to climb it. Thank you.